Around net zero, a topic that has been much in discussion over the past few days, and especially in light of the upcoming Biden summit. Now, simply put, for the uninitiated, net zero means that all the GHG emissions that we put out there, we take them out of the atmosphere. A number of countries are pledging to net zero. Science has proved that this is something that all of us have to aspire to if we have to control the climate vulnerabilities. And there is considerable focus on India on whether it would commit to the net zero targets as well. Now, some have cited challenges that these could be very aspirational targets. This may take away focus from what needs to be done immediately. Maybe there's too much reliance on technologies that are yet to be proven. On the other hand, there are supporters, who see this as an opportunity for India to take leadership, to set a bold and ambitious development plan that addresses the climate vulnerabilities that we are exposed to. Now, what both schools of thoughts are clearly agreeable on is that it has to be an equitable growth. Right now, amidst this noise, one thing that we cannot deny that businesses are already taking action. Businesses are beginning to commit to net zero. And there are many commitments out there. There are many conversations out there. And we wanted to take this opportunity that can we understand from some industry thought leaders that what does net zero mean to them? What is it that their businesses are doing? And what are some of the challenges in this commitment? How can we move together? And how can we inspire more and more businesses to start this conversation? Now, I'm delighted to have with me today Mr. P.S. Narayan, the Global Head Sustainability and Social Initiatives, WIPRO Limited. He has been instrumental in the creation of WIPRO's sustainability program and has stewarded it since its inception in early 2008. Now, the company's sustainability charter is built on the core principle that business and social purpose must reinforce each other in addressing several key challenges around ecology and education. Mr. Narayan is also involved in sustainability advocacy as a member of several industry forums and is currently the chairman of the Bangalore chapter of CII Godrej Green Business Center. In addition, he is visiting faculty at the Azim Premji University, where he teaches in the postgraduate program in development. Prior to his current role, he was the global head of information systems for WIPRO's IT business, when he was chosen as one of CIO's global 25 ones to watch. We could not have thought of a better person to start this conversation today, sir. So thank you so much for making the time and speaking to us today. So, sir, if you can just take a little time and unpack for us that what does net zero mean for the industry? How can industry take a lead? And what are some of the pathways that we are considering on this conversation? So, sir, over to you.
Thank you, Devyani, for that introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. To talk about something, yes, that has been the buzz in industry as well as in government circles in civil society for the last few months, which is net zero. As a terminology, net zero might be relatively new. As a concept, it is not. For many companies who have been on the climate change journey for some time now, I think we are all familiar with it. It was called by other names, like carbon neutral and so on and so forth. But of course, in the last few months, after net zero has gained prominence on everybody's radar, some of these differences between net zero and other frameworks has also come out very clearly. One of the differences, for example, between net zero and carbon neutral is that net zero aims at neutralizing all greenhouse gases, not just carbon dioxide. And that's very important. That might seem like a technical, matter of detail, but it's very important in the overall context of global warming, where the greenhouse gases that trap heat in the atmosphere. It's not just carbon dioxide, though of course carbon dioxide is a very important component. There's methane, there's nitrous oxide, and then there are refrigerant gases and so on. And some of these other gases are much more potent than CO2. So therefore, you can't take your eyes off methane and nitrous oxide and HFCs and others. Therefore, net zero tries to be more comprehensive in its scope. Uh, that's one. The second is, as you mentioned at the beginning, in simple terms, net zero is you try to suck out from the atmosphere whatever you put in. Uh, well, I think that is a very key driving principle of net zero, and that's going to, it's already generated a lot of debate, and I think we've not seen the last of that. As we speak, uh, SBTI, Science Based Targets Initiative, um, they are in the process of coming out with a standard framework for what qualifies under net zero and what doesn't. It's already gone through one round of public consultation. They're going into round two. So in a few months, probably they'll come out of the framework. And as we know of what is there in that framework today, uh, any action or project that let us say enables other stakeholders of a company to avoid emissions is not counted in your carbon balance sheet. You can't use that to net off your own emissions. To give a very simple example, in WIPRO, for example, let's say our scope 1 and 2 emissions put together is 100. I'm just using a number for illustration purposes. And our scope 3 emissions, which is our indirect emissions, is let's say 300, so it will be 400. How do we reach net zero? We can, of course, try to reduce our own operational emissions, our own value chain emissions. But let's say we're working with a customer or we're working with customers and we offer solutions to the customers to enable them to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions. We can't use that. We can report that. We can say, we've done it, but we can't use that to net off. The only thing that can be used to net off is anything that sequesters or absorbs carbon dioxide. So these are some of the features or characteristics of the net zero framework that I think will be fine-tuned more and more in the months to come. In some ways, if I have to summarize it, net zero is more comprehensive and more stringent as it should be. I'm going to pause here because there's a lot more to talk, but I'm going to pause here so that you can.
No, thank you, sir, for putting that into context, because as you said, it's more comprehensive and it's definitely far more ambitious. And, because the rigor that it is putting in, so it brings us to the conversation that, how can we engage all stakeholders, right? Because it is always a challenge. And this was even with emission reduction, especially that how do you bring SMEs into this conversation? Because without them, we're not even reaching anywhere, right? I can control our own footprint. So what does this mean for the SMEs, which is already struggling? There are a lot of programs, but this increased rigor, what does it mean for them? And how can we include them in this conversation?
Yes, I think that's going to be a crucial part of the whole story as it unfolds. Now, one big challenge for large companies like us is scope 3 emissions, because scope 3 emissions, by definition, also it means that those emissions that are not under the company's direct operational control. It could mean emissions from airline, from business travel, like flights that you take. It could be emissions from employee commuting, and it is emissions from the embedded carbon footprint of all the goods and services that you purchase from your supply chain, from your suppliers. Typically, the last part is often one of the largest, if not the largest, components of your supply chain. In fact, even for a services organization like us, purchased goods and services is the biggest component of our scope 3 carbon GHG emissions. So for manufacturing companies like automobiles, FMCG and all others, which have deep supply chains, purchase goods and services from the supply chain will surely be a very large part. Now, so let me start, take as the entry point what a large company like us can do to reduce our scope 3 emissions, because that will in some way segue into what could be possibly do with SMEs, right? So if I have to reduce the GHG footprint of my purchase goods and services, how do I do that? The only way I can do this to partner and collaborate with my suppliers, you know, big and small. I have to partner with them. That will mean that you invest in capacity building, you work with them, you help them overcome the first few obstacles. So there's a lot of handholding, collaborative working that a large company has the responsibility to do when it comes to its smaller suppliers. Right? And that is the only way, slowly, step by step, that you can reduce the GHG footprint of your purchased goods and services. Of course, there will be larger systemic forces that will also contribute to the reduction of the footprint from your suppliers. For example, as the grid becomes greener, as India's grid becomes greener with the addition of more renewable energy capacity, the grid factor itself will reduce, therefore reducing the carbon footprint of your purchased goods and services. That is one. Second is, in some categories, you will see that technology, advances faster than others. The cement industry is one example, where in spite of being one of the biggest polluters and contributors to greenhouse gas emissions in the world, cement industry has seen a lot of traction and action in terms of reducing its own operational carbon footprint. So, and that, the diffusing effect within the cement industry will help WIPRO as a purchaser of cement, let's say, for its construction projects, to reduce our own carbon. That's second. And another good example is electrification of transport, electric vehicles, right? So if a BPO company, for example, which uses a large fleet of cabs to ferry its employees back and forth, I think it will see sooner or later that its fleet is more and more electric, right? And which means that its own carbon footprint from employee commuting is coming down, and its suppliers are also therefore in the process that they have become more low carbon, right? So some of these larger systemic forces will play a role, but if a company wants to accelerate its own journey to net zero, then it must work collaboratively with its partners.
No, thank you. I think you touched on quite a few points because collaboration, you clearly, I mean, we've always heard that SMEs need a lot of handholding and capacity building. It's not just setting targets with them. And I think it would be interesting to know because there are some things that a company can do of its own initiative, but I think we can't expect the large company also to drive everything, and you've mentioned about some of the systemic changes, but if we look at SMEs itself, that, one is technical capacity building and then is the financial support, because that's one of the biggest challenges. So what are some of the other things, where you see challenges? Because you've mentioned technology, you've mentioned systemic changes, and I think a company has a responsibility that if policy is moving in a direction, how can they accelerate action in their operations? And it has many scopes. It's not just manufacturing. It's like you said, with their customers, with their employees, with the value chains, it's at various levels and awareness. But, how does the industry also need to be supported more when they have to magnify this conversation and magnify these initiatives?
Yes, I think one way in which industry must do this, as you said, companies can do only so much on their own. So they must come together and they must leverage the industry networks that are there currently to drive action among the SMEs. The CII Forum, for example, which I chair, we are in fact, starting net zero program which is centered around SME suppliers, right? And I think some of our larger companies in the traditional engineering and manufacturing industry have done well on this front without calling it net zero, so far. They're calling it net zero. They have really set examples of how to partner with their suppliers and go on the journey of energy efficiency and renewable energy. They may not have technically called it net zero. I think one challenge though among SMEs is SMEs, of course, is a very it's a catch-all term which it includes so many different sizes and sectors of companies. One big challenge that even large companies is going to face is they do okay when it comes to tier one with their suppliers with who they interact. But I think when it comes to tier two and tier three, with who we never see them, right? A automobile manufacturer will interact with the manufacturer of the steering wheel, right? But they will not interact with the components of the steering wheel manufacturers. So that's where there will be a challenge, because there you're saying, can I cascade this capacity building, training, and all of that, this collaborative approach down my supply chain? If you have to do that, then your tier one suppliers have to be ready to play the role that you are doing. And that is easier said than done, even if the tier one suppliers are ready, because this kind of collaborative long-term partnering requires resources, requires people, to be committed to this, right? And all said and done, many companies which are smaller in size may not be able to have uh, uh, the resources problem is a big challenge for them. Right? So that's where I think there's going to be one big challenge. Right? Where how do you go down to tier two and tier three?
No, absolutely. I think this is a challenge we've always had in the driving sustainability discussions, right? That at tier one, they've all done very well, but we lose transparency also after that. And I think that narrative is slowly, very slowly beginning to change. And I think it is about, like you said, about capacity building, but also how do we look at incentives and how do we look at, how do we build a business case that more transparency. And when we look at more transparent value chains, I think to some extent it's going to get addressed. But I also think a mindset shift, because I think there's also a lack of mistrust that with being too transparent actually mean that it's going to lead to more punishment rather than collaboration. So I think that mindset change, that we know that there is a problem and let's work together towards that problem. The idea is that let's understand what the problem is, and I think also some organizations on the ground are also working a lot through worker empowerment, not just for their rights, but also speaking about good place practices. Like I know of an organization which works with the workers in the automobile industry to create awareness on what their rights are if there is an injury. And the workers are then saying that why is our factory not audited on the workplace practices that they have? So, we have to look at this narrative from various perspectives and how can we bring everyone into this conversation. So I
Yeah.
think that's a very important point that you have brought. And it's a problem that we've been grappling for quite some time, so
Right.
self regulation, that's something that will drive. But also if we look at more and more incentives, because for the longest time it's been very cost driven, it's the only focus has been that how cost competitive can I be, which is a very short term vision. So I totally agree. But you also brought out a
Right.
very, important point on the industry networks. And that sort of brings me to the question, because WIPRO has been a founding member of Transform to Net Zero. So it is a
Mhm.
coalition of like-minded organizations. And it would be nice to hear a bit more about this initiative, and what is planned and how we can look at more and more businesses joining such coalitions.
Right. Right. I think the TNZ, the Transform to Net Zero initiative, is uh, one of the many things that have happened in the last 12 months on net zero. I think after that, we've had investment banks form net zero partnerships, and and there are other examples, very interesting examples. So our TNZ forum consists of 9 companies. Uh, it was convened by Microsoft globally, and it has other companies like Unilever, Nike, Starbucks, and so on. And so we are one of them. I think the value that we saw in joining a forum like this is because we understand, in spite of having been on the climate change journey for the last 15 plus years, uh, you know, the challenges ahead of us especially if you have to get to an ambitious target like net zero, are, are of such nature that we can't do it alone. We can't say, okay, I know how to do this. I've done this for so many years. So we will need to collaborate. We need to listen to others, and we will need to, there are certain things that are probably best done collectively, and there are certain things that we can draw upon from others' experiences and incorporate into our own programs. That is the reason why we joined this coalition. As things stand, I think the coalition is engaged very intensely with SBTI and other standard bodies because the definition of net zero itself is yet to be finalized. SBTI is doing that, but the last few months have given us sufficient understanding of what is likely to be the final definition of net zero, so that it helps us prepare going ahead. So as I had said earlier, we know now for a fact that the emissions that we help our customers avoid or our communities avoid, let's say, through CSR programs, you can't use that in the calculus of netting off in the balance sheet as things stand. So if you look at, if a company looks at it very, from a very instrumental perspective, okay, this is not going to help me get to net zero, why should I do it, right? And that raises all kinds of interesting questions and dilemmas to companies. We think, for example, that you should do something on its own merits, on its own intrinsic merits, right? So if working with customers is good for you, it's good for the customer, you should go ahead and do it. Not whether it helps you to reach your net zero journey or not, a target or not, is different. Similarly, if there is a CSR initiative that you work with the community, let's take the most common example of clean cooking stove, which helps avoid emissions. Should you do it or not? If you think it's worthwhile doing it from your community's perspective, not because it contributes to net zero, because it's that's a different thing. So I think that's an important element of thinking about this that companies are now realizing, right? The second part of it of our coalition is, and that's one reason why we decided to join, is that we've always been skeptical about offsets. And he said that which is why we never declared, before the net zero coalition came about, we never declared a carbon neutral target for ourselves. We said that our approach is that we must decarbonize our own operations, our own supply chain as much as possible, because that's the right thing to do. So reduce scope 1, 2, 3, right? In the process, if you don't get to being carbon neutral, that's fine. And that's not important. That was our thinking, right? And if you see, practically and technically, it's impossible to decarbonize your own operations to zero in the next 20, 30 years. You're not going to be able to do it. In fact, even the renewable energy that you procure, either through PPAs or through capture, now SBTI is revising its framework to say that the renewable energy that companies procure cannot be treated as zero emissions, right? Because there is an element of carbon footprint in that entire supply chain, right? So you can't treat it as zero emissions, right? So there will be a residual part of it, right? So therefore, you can never reach zero through direct decarbonization, right? So it's technically not possible. So our approach, and I'm happy to say that's broadly the approach of most of the constituents of our net zero coalition, is defer and postpone offsets, which in the net zero framework is pillar C. Pillar A is direct decarbonization of your supply chain and your operations. Pillar B is avoided emissions, and pillar C is sequestered carbon. Defer pillar C or offsets as much as possible, right? So our target here is 2040, and we are not touching offsets till 2040. So till 2039, our targets are all within our operations and within our supply chain. Of course, we are going to work very closely with customers during this period. That is pillar B, but pillar B doesn't count. We only look at offsets only from 2040 onwards, when our residual emissions has come down below 5% of the world. That's it. That's our approach.
No,
And one last thing. I think many other companies are very similar. Unilever is 2039. Two, three other companies, I think, are 2050, right? Of course, Microsoft is 2030. But by and large, people are saying we are going to defer offsets as much as possible.
No, I think that's wonderful to hear, because I think one of the biggest concerns around net target was that, are we going to increase emissions? But this is saying that we'll continue action in our immediate operations and our supply chains to keep reducing those emissions, and its offset is absolutely the last option. So I think here is a way forward to actually counter some of those arguments that are put up against net zero, and I think this is clear action we're doing. And I think it's also important, like you said, that what does net zero mean for India? It always happens, like the definition I'm talking about from a definition perspective, right? Because we are seeing that even today, when we are looking to define what sustainable finance means for India, of course there is a lot of conversation out there. There are accepted definitions, but we always have to look at our context. And you touched upon the CSR law, and it is an important avenue for a lot of positive action happening. So I think to understand the differentiation of the two, that one shouldn't stop just because it does not contribute to net zero, is perhaps very important to understand. And net zero is just one of the strategies, to the overall sustainability journey that an organization has. And I think that is always very, very important to keep in mind, So
that's true.
This I think has been excellent, because this is truly like action oriented. This is what is happening. And from what I understand and what I'm hearing is that there will be a lot of capacity building also. You talked about, investment banks coming together on net zero. I would be very interested. I think this is a whole conversation on what it means for the financial and investing sector in India, right? Because we've been, over the years, we first talked about clean energy, then we've talked about like energy efficiency, solar, then we are thinking about circular, and now we have net zero, right? And how do we get the financial sector onto this conversation much quicker? Because without their support, and really demystifying it for them, because from what I understand, there are quite a few technicalities involved as well on what is net zero, what is not net zero. So I think those are some important conversations or important capacity building initiatives that we have to structure, if as a country also, or even as a sector, we want quicker action. So, I think that is also something that is opening avenues. So just wanted to invite you, sir, for some closing thoughts, because there's a lot that your company is doing. There is a coalition. That how can we encourage, invite more businesses to be part? Like, do you see a transform to net zero, more representation from businesses in India? Is that something that we should aspire to?
I think that is something that will happen as a natural course, especially among the larger companies in India. One good thing about Indian companies as far as sustainability is concerned is they've been very quick to respond and get involved in many of these initiatives over the last decade plus, whether it's climate change or water, biodiversity, or disclosures and reporting. However, I have to qualify that the same, that by and large, of course, it's been the larger companies. And it's for reasons that we discussed earlier. I think medium and small companies find it a little bit more difficult, and they need all the help. So there has been a movement on that, recently, in the last few years, 5 years or so. But we need a lot more. So given that, I have no doubt that Indian companies will come on board the net zero guideline, the net zero movement, and that is good. I think what's important is, though, to keep oneself clear-headed and grounded when you commit yourself to net zero as a company. And it touches again, it goes back to some of these points that we were discussing just now. Businesses do like targets, right? They like to go after targets, which is good. And I think one of the value or one value of framework like net zero is that even if your target is aspirational and ambitious, it galvanizes action, within the company, within the supply chain. It sort of catalyzes everybody to say, okay, what can we do to reduce it, right? And businesses are very good at that. I have a target, I need to get there, so I work backward. Okay, these are the things I need to do. So that's good. It will galvanize action. At the same time, there is the risk that it can straitjacket you. It can straitjacket you into looking only at that number and nothing else. Okay, and one manifestation of that is, of course, that you decide to offset early. You say, I'm going to start offsetting in 2025 onwards. And one apprehension that is there on this count is the cost of offsetting is much less than the cost of direct decarbonization. As we speak, there's a range of figures, but it ranges from $1 to $40 to $45 per ton of offsets, okay, which is much less than if you have to do your own decarbonization. It's an easy way out, right? So it can manifest as quicker offsetting, which is not great, because one of the big questions that people are debating and are not able to find answers is, from a simple math perspective, everybody decides to offset through afforestation. Is there enough land on our planet available for creating that afforestation? And the answer is no. I think back of the envelope calculations, so no, there's not enough land. So, there will be a queue of companies, hypothetically, who say, I want to offset, but there's not enough land. And of course, there are social issues of displacement of people and all of that. So offsets can be very tricky and must be handled very carefully. But it must incorporate social concerns. It must incorporate even ecological concerns. Not all offsets are the same quality, and so on. The second thing is, companies must make sure that, as again we said earlier, you don't lose sight of adjacent goals that are equally, if not more important. I think for India, we've been saying this for a while, but adaptation is very important. Adaptation to our coastal zones, in adaptation of our farmer community in terms of, how do they change their crop mix in the face of extreme weather events. Now, just because adaptation does not contribute to your net zero arithmetic, right? You should not take your eyes off, right? So it's very critical when you look at it from a country perspective, from an overall systems perspective, that you look at all these elements that need to come together to reach true net zero, not only for a country but for the whole world, right? We should be clear-headed about these things.
No, absolutely. I think very, very nicely put, because you started and you said collaboration. And I think even this whole collaboration is not just delivering, but I think defining that roadmap, like you said, for the whole system towards net zero also requires all the heads to come together. That, whether policy, whether regulation and businesses work together. That, for example, when do we start with the offsets? Do we look at a balance between the two, so that there is a very measured approach with that. So I think this has been a great conversation, because, and this is exactly what we were looking for, that can we unpack this conversation a little bit, that when it's talking about action on the ground, when it's talking about industry, what does it, what we need to consider, what do we always need to have at the back of our heads, what are the challenges that we know we are going to face. And I think some great insights that you've talked about. We know that networks, we know that collaborations are always the need of the hour, but the fact that you say that don't lose sight of the other goals, don't lose sight of the bigger picture, I think is something that we definitely need to keep in mind. And that even with net zero and the concerns that have been expressed, that there are very clear action goals that can be looked at, which actually address those concerns and look at actual action on the ground. So thank you so much. I think this has been a fantastic session, and this has been a great learning. So you take care and have a lovely day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Devyani. Pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.